Right now, as you listen to these words, your brain is performing one of the most mysterious acts in the known universe. It's creating the vivid, undeniable experience of being you. The colours you see, the emotions you feel, the very sense that there's someone home inside your head experiencing all of this. But what if I told you that this entire experience, this feeling of consciousness itself, has been described by some neuroscientists as functioning like an elaborate internal modelling process your brain performs? What if the most fundamental aspect of your existence could be interpreted as an illusion so convincing that even neuroscientists are only now beginning to peek behind the curtain? Welcome back to another journey into the mysteries that shape our understanding of reality. I'm here to guide you through one of the most profound questions facing modern science and philosophy. Today, we're exploring a possibility that might fundamentally change how you think about yourself, your thoughts, and the very nature of being aware. We're diving into the emerging scientific view that consciousness, as we experience it, may not be exactly what it appears to be. Before we begin this exploration together, find yourself in a comfortable position. Let your breathing settle into its natural rhythm, because what we're about to discover isn't just an abstract philosophical puzzle. It's a journey that touches the very core of what you believe yourself to be. And like all the most profound scientific discoveries, it begins with questioning what seems most obvious. The idea that consciousness might function like an illusion isn't some fringe theory cooked up by philosophers with too much time on their hands. It's emerging from cutting-edge neuroscience labs, from researchers who spend their days mapping the brain's intricate networks, measuring neural activity down to individual cells, and trying to solve what many consider the hardest problem in science: the problem of consciousness itself. To understand why scientists are beginning to question the assumed nature of consciousness as we experience it, we need to start with something that feels absolutely certain. Right now, you have the unmistakable experience of being aware. You're not just processing information like a computer. There's something it feels like to be you experiencing this moment. There's what philosophers call the subjective, qualitative nature of experience. The redness of red, the pain of a headache, the joy of hearing your favourite song. This felt quality of experience has a name in philosophy and neuroscience. They call it qualia. And qualia seem to be the most undeniable aspect of reality. After all, you can doubt many things, but can you really doubt that you're having experiences right now? This is what makes consciousness seem so real, so fundamental. But here's where things get interesting. When neuroscientists look at the brain, they find something puzzling. They can identify neural networks that process visual information, networks that handle memory, networks that control attention. They can even predict with a remarkable accuracy what you're thinking about just by watching the patterns of activity in your brain. But nowhere in this vast network of neurons do they find anything that directly corresponds to the consciousness you're experiencing. Think about it this way. Your brain is essentially a biological computer processing information through electrical and chemical signals. When you see a red apple, specific neurons fire in response to particular wavelengths of light. Other neurons process the shape, the texture, the context. But where exactly is the experience of redness? Where is that subjective feeling that makes red feel like red rather than blue or green? This is what cognitive scientist David Chalmers famously called the hard problem of consciousness. It's not just about explaining how the brain processes information. That's what he called the easy problems. Though they're hardly easy, the hard problem is explaining why there should be any subjective experience accompanying all this information processing. Why should there be something it's like to be you? And here's where the plot thickens. Some of the world's leading consciousness researchers are beginning to suggest that maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe the hard problem is hard because consciousness, as we think we experience it, may not exist in the way we intuitively assume. One of the most compelling theories emerging from this new way of thinking comes from neuroscientist Michael Graziano at Princeton University. His attention schema theory offers a radically different perspective on what we call consciousness, and it suggests that our vivid sense of inner experience might be more like a user interface than a window into reality. Here's the basic idea. Your brain is constantly managing attention, deciding which of the countless streams of information flowing through your nervous system deserve processing resources. Should you focus on the conversation you're having or the sound of traffic outside? Should you pay attention to the text you're reading or that slight ache in your shoulder? Now, to manage attention effectively, your brain needs to keep track of what it's attending to. Just like your computer's operating system needs to track which programs are running and how much processing power they're using. Graziano suggests that consciousness is essentially your brain's simplified model of its own attention processes. Think of it like this. When you introspect, when you turn your attention inward to examine your own mental states, you're not directly accessing some inner theatre where experiences play out. Instead, you're accessing your brain's schematic model of what it's paying attention to. And this model, like any model, is a simplification. It leaves out the complex neurochemical details and presents you with something much more streamlined, something that feels like pure subjective experience. This might sound abstract, but consider what happens when you try to pay attention to your own attention. Notice how you can become aware of what you're focusing on, how you can deliberately shift your attention from one thing to another. What the attention schema theory suggests is that this sense of being aware of your awareness is your brain accessing its own control model. As you listen to this idea, take a moment to notice your own attention right now. Can you sense how your focus might be shifting between my words? Perhaps some background sounds, maybe thoughts that arise in response to what you're hearing. What you're experiencing in this moment of self-reflection might be exactly what Graziano is describing. Your brain's model of its own attentional state, simplified and presented to you as conscious awareness. The elegance of this theory is that it explains why consciousness feels so real and immediate, while also explaining why it's so difficult to pin down scientifically. It's real in the sense that your brain really is constructing this model, but it's an illusion in the technical sense of a simplified internal representation, meaning the model doesn't accurately represent what's actually happening in your neural networks. It's like a simplified dashboard in a car. The speedometer gives you useful information about how fast you're going, but it doesn't show you the complex mechanical and electronic systems actually making the car move. But the attention schema theory is just one piece of a larger puzzle. Another influential framework for understanding consciousness comes from cognitive scientist Bernard Baars and his global workspace theory. This approach offers a different but complementary perspective on why consciousness might be more like a story your brain tells itself than a fundamental feature of reality. Baars noticed something crucial about consciousness. Only a tiny fraction of your brain's activity ever becomes conscious. Right now, your brain is managing your heartbeat, regulating your body temperature, processing visual information from your peripheral vision, maintaining your balance, and performing countless other tasks. but you're only consciously aware of a small spotlight of this activity. The global workspace theory suggests that consciousness is like a theatre stage in your brain. Countless unconscious processes are happening in the audience, behind the scenes, in the lighting booth, but only the information that makes it onto the stage, into the bright spotlight, becomes conscious. And what determines what gets on stage? Competition. Different brain networks are constantly competing for access to what Bars calls the global workspace. The network that wins this competition gets to broadcast its information widely throughout the brain, making it available to memory systems, decision-making processes, and language areas. And this widespread broadcasting, this global availability of information, is what we experience as consciousness. But here's the fascinating part. The global workspace theory suggests that consciousness isn't a thing or a place in the brain. It's a process. It's the dynamic pattern of information flow that emerges when one set of neural processes wins the competition for attention and gets to influence the rest of the brain. Think about what this means for your sense of being a unified, continuous self. At any given moment, different aspects of your mental life are competing for access to consciousness. Memories, sensory impressions, emotions, thoughts, plans for the future. The winner of this competition becomes your conscious experience in that moment. But there's no central observer watching this competition. There's no little person inside your head experiencing these mental contents. There's just the process itself, the dynamic flow of information that your brain interprets as unified conscious experience. This perspective starts to make consciousness look less like a spotlight, illuminating a pre-existing inner world, and more like a story that emerges from the complex interactions of unconscious processes. A story that your brain tells itself about what's most important to pay attention to right now. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence that consciousness may be more constructed than it appears comes from studying what happens when the brain's normal integration processes break down. Split brain patients, people who have had the connection between their brain's two hemispheres severed to treat severe epilepsy, offer a fascinating window into how consciousness might be assembled. In these patients, the two halves of the brain can sometimes seem to have separate streams of consciousness. The left hemisphere, which typically controls language, can describe what it's experiencing. But the right hemisphere, which is largely non-verbal, can only express itself through the left hand's actions. Researchers have found that these two hemispheres can sometimes disagree, want different things, even work at cross purposes. What's particularly striking is that the verbal left hemisphere often doesn't seem to know what the right hemisphere is doing. When researchers show an image only to the right hemisphere, the person will claim they didn't see anything, but their left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, can point to or draw what was shown. Even more intriguingly, the left hemisphere will often confabulate explanations for actions initiated by the right hemisphere. If researchers secretly signal the right hemisphere to make the person stand up and walk, the left hemisphere will confidently explain why they decided to get some exercise or fetch a drink, having no awareness that the decision came from the other half of their brain. This suggests that our normal sense of unified consciousness might be more like a post hoc narrative than a real-time experience. Your brain might be constantly generating explanations for its own behavior, creating a coherent story of intentional action and unified experience, even when the actual processes driving behavior are more fragmented and unconscious than you realize. And this interpretive storytelling aspect of consciousness shows up in more everyday situations too. Have you ever found yourself in the middle of an action and realized you don't remember deciding to do it? Walking to the kitchen and realizing you're not sure why you went there? Starting to say something and forgetting what you meant to say? These moments might offer glimpses into how much of your behavior is actually driven by unconscious processes, with consciousness providing commentary after the fact. Recent neuroscience research has begun to identify specific brain regions that seem to be involved in creating and maintaining our sense of conscious experience. And surprisingly, many of these regions aren't in the parts of the brain that process sensory information or control behavior. Instead, they're in areas associated with social cognition, self-reflection, and narrative construction. The posterior cingulate cortex, for example, seems to be crucial for maintaining our sense of self. When this region is damaged or disrupted, people often report profound changes in their sense of personal identity and continuity of experience. But this region isn't processing raw sensory data or controlling movement. It seems to be involved in integrating information about the self across time, creating that sense of being the same person who had experiences yesterday and will have experiences tomorrow. Similarly, the default mode network, a set of brain regions that are most active when we're not focused on the external world, seems to be heavily involved in self-referential thinking, autobiographical memory, and imagining future scenarios. This network is constantly active when you're daydreaming, reflecting on your experiences, or planning what to do next. What's fascinating is that these self-referential brain networks seem to be telling us stories about ourselves. They're not just processing information, they're constructing narratives about who we are, what we've experienced, what we want, how we relate to others. And a growing body of research suggests that these narratives may be more interpretive and constructed than we typically realize. Consider how your sense of self changes throughout the day. Are you the same person when you first wake up, groggy and disoriented, as you are in the middle of an engaging conversation with a friend? Are you the same person when you're focused intently on a challenging task as when you're relaxed and letting your mind wander? These different states of consciousness don't just feel different, they seem to involve different patterns of brain activity, different balances between various neural networks. What we call consciousness might be more like a collection of different modes of information processing than a single, unified phenomenon. Take a breath here and consider your own experience as you've been listening to these ideas. Have you noticed how your attention has shifted? How your sense of engagement with these concepts has ebbed and flowed? How different thoughts and reactions have emerged and dissolved? This dynamic, ever-changing quality of consciousness is exactly what makes it so difficult to pin down scientifically. The emerging picture from neuroscience research is that consciousness might be less like a thing you have and more like a process you do, less like a spotlight illuminating a pre-existing inner world, and more like a constantly updating story your brain tells about its own activity. But if consciousness can be understood as an illusion, why would evolution have created such an elaborate one? This is where the story gets even more intriguing, because illusions aren't necessarily bad things. They can serve important functions, especially when they simplify complex information in useful ways. Think about your visual experience right now. You probably feel like you're seeing a rich, detailed visual world all around you. But vision researchers have discovered that you actually only see clearly in a tiny area at the center of your visual field. Everything else is much blurrier than you realize. Your brain is constantly moving your eyes to sample different parts of the visual scene and then stitching together a seamless, detailed impression of the whole environment. This is a useful illusion. It would be overwhelming and inefficient for your brain to process every detail of your visual environment all the time. Instead, it creates the impression of rich detail while actually focusing processing resources only where they're needed. Consciousness might work similarly, creating the impression of rich, unified experience while actually coordinating much more limited and fragmented processes. The attention schema theory suggests that consciousness evolved because it's useful for brains to have a model of their own attention. If you're going to control and direct your attention effectively, it helps to have some representation of what you're currently attending to. And if you're going to understand and predict other people's behaviour, it helps to have a model of what they might be paying attention to. But like any model, this attention schema simplifies reality. It leaves out the complex details of neural processing and presents a streamlined version that's easier to work with. The result is the feeling that there's a unified self, observing and experiencing a rich inner world. But what's actually happening is much more distributed and fragmented. This evolutionary perspective helps explain why the constructed experience of consciousness is so compelling. If consciousness is a control system that helps manage attention and social behaviour, then it needs to feel real and immediate. A control system that constantly reminded you it was just a simplified model wouldn't be very effective. So your brain doesn't just create the constructed experience of consciousness. It creates an illusion that feels absolutely convincing, an illusion that includes the strong intuition that consciousness can't possibly be an illusion. After all, how could something that feels so immediate and undeniable be anything other than what it seems to be? As we continue this exploration together, we'll dive deeper into what this means for how you understand yourself, your relationships, and your place in the world. We'll examine the latest research on how the brain constructs the sense of self, why some meditation traditions have long suggested that the self may function like an illusion, and what it might mean to live with the knowledge that your most fundamental experience of being you might not be exactly what it seems. But first, let's pause here and let these ideas settle. Because what we're exploring isn't just an abstract scientific theory, it's a perspective that could fundamentally change how you relate to your own mind, your own sense of identity, and the mystery of what it means to be conscious in an apparently unconscious universe. The journey we're taking together will challenge some of your most basic assumptions about reality, but it will also open up new ways of understanding the remarkable, complex, and perhaps more mysterious than ever phenomenon of human consciousness. The brain that's creating your experience of listening to these words right now may be operating through mechanisms so sophisticated that even science is only beginning to understand how they work. But what happens when we turn this scientific lens inward, examining the very tool we're using to examine everything else? When consciousness studies itself, we enter a hall of mirrors that reveals something profoundly unsettling about the nature of self-awareness. Consider this simple experiment. Right now, try to observe your own thoughts. Notice how one thought arises, perhaps about what you had for breakfast, then fades as another emerges, maybe about something you need to do later today. As you watch this stream of mental activity, ask yourself, who is doing the watching? This question has puzzled philosophers and neuroscientists for decades. When you observe your own thoughts, there seems to be an observer and something being observed. But neuroscience suggests that both the observer and the observed can be understood as constructions of the same underlying neural processes. There's no separate self sitting in a control room watching thoughts play out on mental screens. Instead, there's a recursive loop where the brain appears to generate the sense of a watcher watching itself. Dr. Anil Seth, a leading consciousness researcher at the University of Sussex, describes this as the brain's ultimate magic trick. The same neural networks that generate thoughts also generate the sense that someone is having those thoughts. It's like a ventriloquist who becomes so skilled that even they forget they're the one making the puppet talk. This recursive nature of consciousness creates what philosophers call the transparency problem. When you look out at the world, you don't normally notice your visual system working. You don't see your blind spots, your eye movements, or the way your brain fills in missing information. Similarly, when you introspect, you don't notice the mechanisms creating your sense of self-awareness. The process remains transparent to itself. Take a moment to feel the weight of this idea. The sense that there's a continuous you experiencing these words, having these thoughts, can be understood as more like a constantly updated story than a fixed reality. Each moment, your brain assembles neural activity into the impression of unified experience. But this assembly process happens below the threshold of awareness. Recent advances in brain imaging have begun to reveal the neural machinery behind our sense of self. And what researchers have found challenges our intuitive understanding of personal identity in surprising ways. The brain regions most associated with self-awareness aren't the ones processing immediate sensory experience. Instead, they're areas involved in memory integration, social cognition, and narrative construction. The medial prefrontal cortex, for instance, becomes active when we think about ourselves, our relationships, or our place in social hierarchies. But this region doesn't house some essential self. Rather, it coordinates information from across the brain to construct a moment-by-moment sense of identity. Dr. Antonio Damasio's research at USC has shown that patients with damage to specific brain regions can lose different aspects of selfhood while retaining others. Some lose autobiographical memory, but maintain a sense of present moment awareness. Others retain detailed memories, but lose the feeling that these memories belong to them. These cases suggest that what we call the self may be best understood as a collection of separate processes that normally work together seamlessly. Even more intriguingly, neuroscientist Dr. Judson Brewer's work with advanced meditators has revealed that the sense of self can be temporarily suspended while awareness continues. During deep meditative states, brain scans show decreased activity in the default mode network, the collection of regions normally active during self-referential thinking. Practitioners report experiences of pure awareness without a sense of someone doing the experiencing. These findings point toward a startling possibility. The self might function more like an app running on the brain's operating system than a fundamental feature of consciousness. And like any app, it can sometimes crash, glitch, or be temporarily shut down while the underlying system continues functioning. As you consider this, notice your own sense of selfhood right now. Can you detect the subtle feeling of being someone, having a perspective, being located somewhere behind your eyes? This feeling may be one of the brain's most sophisticated internal models, so seamless that it's nearly impossible to catch in the act of being constructed. One of the most revealing aspects of consciousness research involves timing. Our sense of experiencing the present moment in real time turns out to be another carefully constructed internal representation, one that reveals just how much post-processing goes into creating conscious experience. Consider what happens when you move your eyes to look at something new. Your visual system goes briefly offline during the eye movement, creating gaps in visual input dozens of times per minute. Yet you never notice these gaps. Your brain backfills the missing time, creating the impression of continuous visual experience. Even more dramatically, research by Dr. David Eagleman has shown that the brain can revise its interpretation of events retroactively. In his famous experiments, participants watch a brief flash of light followed by a sound. If the timing is just right, people report hearing the sound before seeing the light, even though the light actually occurred first. The brain reorders the sequence to create a more coherent narrative of events. This temporal flexibility extends to our sense of making decisions. Neuroscientist Dr. Benjamin Libet's groundbreaking experiments showed that brain activity indicating a decision begins several hundred milliseconds before people report being aware of deciding. The conscious experience of choice may reflect the brain's after-the-fact story about neural events that have already occurred. Dr. Michael Gazzaniga's work with split brain patients reveals how sophisticated this storytelling process can be. When researchers secretly instruct one hemisphere to perform an action, the verbal hemisphere will confidently fabricate an explanation for behavior it didn't initiate. The brain seems to be constantly generating plausible narratives about its own activity, creating the impression of intentional, rational action, even when behavior emerges from unconscious processes. This suggests that consciousness may function more like a narrator than a director. Rather than controlling the flow of mental events, it might be interpreting and packaging neural activity into coherent stories about what's happening and why. Perhaps nowhere is the constructed nature of consciousness more apparent than in how it emerges through social interaction. The attention schema theory suggests that our sense of inner awareness actually evolved from our need to understand what others are paying attention to. Think about how naturally you can tell where someone is looking, what they're focused on, whether they're paying attention to you. This social monitoring of attention requires sophisticated neural machinery. Your brain must model not just your own attentional states, but those of everyone around you. Dr. Michael Tomasello's research on child development shows that human infants begin tracking others' attention within their first months of life. By their first birthday, they can follow pointing gestures, share attention with others, and even manipulate others' attention for their own purposes. This social attention emerges before children show clear evidence of self-awareness. The implication is profound. We might understand others as conscious beings before we understand ourselves as conscious. Our sense of inner awareness could arise from the brain applying its social attention modeling systems to its own processes. In other words, consciousness may emerge when the brain starts treating itself like another person. This social origin of consciousness helps explain why isolation can be so psychologically damaging. Without others to reflect our mental states back to us, the neural systems that construct our sense of self can begin to malfunction. Solitary confinement, even for short periods, can produce hallucinations, paranoia, and severe identity confusion. It also explains why consciousness can feel so inherently relational. When you think about your deepest experiences of awareness, they often involve connection with others, the feeling of being truly seen and understood by another person, the shared attention during meaningful conversation, the sense of collective awareness during group meditation or religious experiences. If consciousness is fundamentally a social phenomenon, then the idea of a purely private, internal self might itself be an oversimplification. Your sense of being an isolated individual, experiencing the world from inside your own head, could be influenced by social cognitive systems designed for very different purposes. For thousands of years, contemplative traditions have suggested that careful introspection reveals the illusory nature of the self. Buddhist meditation, in particular, emphasizes the practice of mindfulness as a way to see through the constructed nature of personal identity. Modern neuroscience is now providing a scientific framework for understanding these ancient insights. When experienced meditators describe their deepest states of awareness, they often report a dissolution of the normal subject-object distinction. There's awareness, but no sense of someone doing the being aware. There's experience, but no experiencer. These descriptions align remarkably well with what neuroscience tells us about how consciousness is constructed. Dr. Judson Brewer's research at Yale has shown that advanced meditators show decreased activity in the default mode network during both meditation and rest. This network, which includes the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex, is most active during self-referential thinking. Its quieting corresponds with reports of selfless awareness. But here's the paradox. If consciousness can be understood as an illusion, how can meditation reveal this? If there's no real self to begin with, what's doing the observing that sees through the illusion? This apparent contradiction points to something subtle about the nature of awareness itself. The attention schema theory offers one possible resolution. What meditation might reveal is not the absence of consciousness, but the difference between awareness and the brain's model of awareness. There's still information processing happening. There's still attention being directed and controlled. But the simplified model that normally creates the sense of a unified self, observing distinct mental contents, can become transparent. As you reflect on your own moments of meditative awareness, you might notice something similar. Times when thoughts arise and pass without a strong sense of someone thinking them. Moments when the boundary between observer and observed becomes unclear. These experiences might offer glimpses of consciousness without the usual narrative overlay. This doesn't mean that meditation proves consciousness is an illusion. Rather, it suggests that our normal mode of self-aware consciousness may represent just one possible configuration of underlying neural processes. The brain's capacity to model its own attention can operate in different modes, creating different qualities of subjective experience. If consciousness is indeed sometimes described as a sophisticated illusion created by the brain's information processing systems, what does this mean for how we live our lives? This question touches the heart of human meaning-making, relationships, and moral responsibility. Some people find the idea that consciousness might be an illusion deeply disturbing. If there's no real self, no genuine subjective experience, does anything really matter? Are love, suffering, beauty, and meaning just biochemical processes with no deeper significance? But this reaction might be based on a misunderstanding of what it means for consciousness to be an illusion. When neuroscientists describe consciousness this way, they're not saying that your experiences don't exist or don't matter. They're saying that these experiences are constructed by neural processes in ways that aren't immediately apparent to introspection. Consider an analogy with colour. The redness you experience when looking at a strawberry is, in one sense, an illusion. There's no redness in the light waves reflecting off the strawberry. Redness is constructed by your visual system as a way of categorizing certain wavelengths of light. But this doesn't make the experience of redness any less real or meaningful to you. It's still useful information. It still guides your behavior. It can still evoke emotions and memories. Similarly, your sense of being a conscious self can be understood as a construction of neural processes, but it's still a real and meaningful construction. The The fact that love emerges from neurochemical processes doesn't make love less powerful or significant. The fact that suffering is mediated by specific brain circuits doesn't make it less worthy of compassion. In fact, understanding consciousness as an emergent property of complex neural networks might make it more remarkable, not less. The idea that the universe has evolved systems capable of creating rich, meaningful, subjective experience from purely physical processes is extraordinary. You are a part of the universe that has become aware of itself, even if that awareness is more constructed and provisional than it appears. This perspective might actually enhance rather than diminish our appreciation for consciousness. Just as understanding how a master magician performs their illusions can increase rather than decrease our admiration for their skill, understanding how the brain creates consciousness might deepen our wonder at this remarkable phenomenon. As we continue to unravel the mysteries of consciousness, we're approaching questions that once seemed purely philosophical through rigorous scientific investigation. New technologies for measuring and manipulating brain activity are providing unprecedented insights into how subjective experience emerges from neural processes. Dr. Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory attempts to quantify consciousness mathematically, proposing that consciousness corresponds to a system's capacity to integrate information. While controversial, this approach suggests we might eventually be able to measure consciousness objectively, determining not just whether a system is conscious, but how conscious it is. Other researchers are exploring how consciousness might be altered or enhanced. Dr. Robin Carhart Harris's work with psychedelics shows that substances like psilocybin and LSD can dramatically alter the brain's default mode network, producing experiences of ego dissolution and expanded awareness. These studies are revealing the neural mechanisms underlying different states of consciousness and suggesting new approaches to treating depression, anxiety, and addiction. As artificial intelligence systems become more sophisticated, questions about machine consciousness are moving from science fiction to serious scientific inquiry. If consciousness is indeed an emergent property of information processing systems, might sufficiently complex AI eventually develop genuine subjective experience? Or would such systems only simulate consciousness while lacking the inner life we associate with awareness? These questions aren't merely academic. How we understand consciousness shapes how we think about ethics, meaning, and our place in the universe. If consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, humans might hold a special position in the cosmos. But if consciousness is an emergent property that can arise from various types of complex systems, we might be just one example of the universe becoming aware of itself. For those who enjoy drifting through these explorations without interruption, members get every episode 48 hours early, completely ad-free. You can join them whenever you feel ready. Perhaps the most honest conclusion we can draw from current consciousness research is that we're still in the early stages of understanding one of the most fundamental aspects of existence. The hard problem of consciousness remains unsolved. We don't yet know whether subjective experience will ultimately be explained in purely physical terms, whether it points to something beyond current scientific paradigms, or whether the question itself is based on false assumptions. But there's something valuable in living with this uncertainty. Throughout history, our understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe has undergone dramatic revisions. We've learned that Earth isn't the center of the cosmos, that humans evolved from other species, that matter and energy are interchangeable, that space and time are relative. Each of these discoveries initially seemed to diminish human significance, but ultimately led to deeper and more nuanced understandings of reality. The emerging view of consciousness as a constructed phenomenon might follow a similar trajectory. Rather than diminishing the importance of subjective experience, it might reveal consciousness to be more flexible, more diverse, and more interesting than we previously imagined. As you sit with these ideas, notice how they interact with your own sense of awareness right now. The very fact that you can contemplate the constructed nature of consciousness is itself a remarkable feat of the neural processes we've been discussing. Your brain is using its model of its own attention to consider how that model might be an illusion. It's a kind of cognitive recursion that borders on the paradoxical. This capacity for self-reflection, even if it emerges from purely physical processes, remains one of the most extraordinary phenomena in the known universe. Whether consciousness is fundamental or emergent, unified or fragmented, real or illusory, it represents something precious and worth protecting. The suffering and joy, love and loss, wonder and confusion that characterize conscious experience deserve our care and attention, regardless of their ultimate metaphysical status. The mystery of consciousness continues to unfold, inviting us to question our most basic assumptions about the nature of reality. As we've seen, the brain that creates your sense of being you might be operating through internal models and representations more sophisticated than we ever imagined. But these mechanisms, if that's what they are, have given rise to art and science, compassion and wisdom, the capacity to love and the ability to wonder. Even as we explore the possibility that consciousness might be an elaborate construction, there's something undeniable about the immediacy of your experience right now. The warmth of your breath, the subtle shift of your attention as these words unfold, the gentle current of thoughts and sensations flowing through awareness. If this is an illusion, it's one so complete that even questioning it happens within its embrace. This paradox lies at the heart of what philosophers call the meta-problem of consciousness. If our sense of awareness is indeed constructed by neural processes, why does the illusion feel so absolutely convincing? Why can't we simply think our way out of it? The way we might dispel a visual illusion once we understand how it works? Dr. Keith Frankish at the University of Sheffield suggests that consciousness isn't just any illusion. It's what he calls a necessary illusion, one that's so deeply embedded in how our brains process information that we couldn't function without it. Just as your visual system must construct the impression of a stable, continuous visual world from fragmented retinal images, your brain must construct the impression of unified consciousness from distributed neural activity. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The very persistence of this illusion might be teaching us something profound about the nature of reality itself. What if the feeling that consciousness can't possibly be just neural activity is actually pointing toward limitations in our current scientific explanations about the relationship between mind and matter? Take a moment to feel the weight of your own existence right now. The simple fact that anything feels like anything at all, that there's not just information processing happening in your brain, but something it's like to be the system doing that processing. This quality of experience, this subjective dimension of reality, remains one of the deepest mysteries facing science. As consciousness researchers have pushed deeper into the mystery of subjective experience, some have begun to wonder whether the solution might lie not just in neuroscience, but in the strange realm of quantum mechanics. The idea that quantum physics might play a role in consciousness remains controversial, but it's attracting serious attention from researchers who find that classical physics alone may not fully explain the richness of mental life. The connection isn't as far-fetched as it might initially seem. Your brain, after all, is made of atoms, and atoms follow the laws of quantum mechanics. Every neuron in your head is ultimately composed of particles governed by quantum mechanics. The question isn't whether quantum effects occur in the brain, but whether they play any functionally meaningful role in generating consciousness. Dr. Roger Penrose, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist and mathematician, has proposed that consciousness might emerge from quantum processes occurring within the microtubules of neurons. These tiny protein structures, normally thought of as part of the cell's scaffolding, have been hypothesized to support quantum-level activity at the boundary between the quantum and classical worlds. Working with anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, Penrose developed what they call orchestrated objective reduction theory. This remains unproven and highly speculative, but it suggests that consciousness might arise when quantum superpositions in microtubules reach a critical threshold and collapse into classical states. Each moment of conscious experience would correspond, in this theory, to a quantum event occurring across thousands or millions of neurons simultaneously. The theory attempts to explain why consciousness feels unified and immediate rather than fragmented and delayed. If consciousness emerges from quantum coherence across neural networks, it might happen faster and more holistically than classical neural processing would allow. The strange non-local properties of quantum mechanics have been proposed as a possible explanation for how separate brain regions coordinate to create unified experience. But as you consider this possibility, remember that no scientific consensus exists about quantum theories of consciousness. Most neuroscientists remain skeptical that quantum effects could survive long enough in the warm, noisy environment of the brain to influence neural activity meaningfully. The brain might be too classical, too disrupted by thermal motion and electromagnetic activity for delicate quantum states to persist. Yet there's something intriguing about the parallels between consciousness and quantum mechanics that goes beyond specific theories about brain function. Both domains seem to involve fundamental questions about observation, measurement, and the relationship between subjective and objective reality. In quantum mechanics, the act of observation appears to play a crucial role in determining what happens to quantum systems. Before measurement, a quantum particle exists in a superposition of possible states. The act of observation is often described as collapsing this superposition into a definite outcome. This has led to ongoing debates about whether consciousness itself might be necessary for quantum collapse, or whether any interaction with a measuring device is sufficient. Some interpretations suggest that consciousness might hold a special place in quantum theory, though this remains highly controversial and unproven. The idea that conscious observation might influence quantum events appeals to those seeking a fundamental role for mind in the physical universe. But many physicists argue that quantum collapse occurs through purely physical interactions, without any need for conscious observers. The parallel with consciousness is striking, though metaphorical rather than literal. Just as quantum measurement seems to select one outcome from many possibilities, conscious attention seems to select which aspects of our rich inner life become the focus of awareness. From the countless neural processes occurring simultaneously in your brain, only a small fraction becomes conscious at any given moment. This selection process might be conceptually compared to quantum measurement rather than classical computation. Rather than following deterministic rules, consciousness might emerge from a kind of neural democracy where competing processes vie for attention until one achieves dominance. The winner becomes conscious experience, while the losers fade into the neural background. As you notice your own attention shifting while listening to these ideas, you might sense something of this process in action. Different thoughts, sensations, and reactions compete for the spotlight of awareness. What becomes conscious seems to emerge from this competition rather than being predetermined by any central executive. This connection between consciousness and quantum measurement points toward one of the deepest puzzles in both physics and neuroscience. In quantum mechanics, it's called the measurement problem. In consciousness studies, it's the binding problem. Both ask fundamentally similar questions about how many possibilities become one reality. The binding problem asks how the brain combines separate streams of sensory and cognitive information into unified conscious experience. Right now, your visual system is processing color, motion, form, and depth through different neural pathways. Your auditory system is analyzing frequency, timing, and spatial location independently. Your memory systems are retrieving relevant associations and emotional responses. Yet you don't experience these as separate streams of information. You experience a unified perceptual world where sounds have sources, objects have colors and textures, and everything exists within a coherent spatial and temporal framework. How does the brain bind all this distributed processing into singular conscious moments? Classical neuroscience suggests that binding occurs through neural synchronization. When different brain regions oscillate at the same frequency, their outputs can be integrated into unified representations. Gamma waves, oscillations around 40 cycles per second, seem particularly important for binding conscious experience. But some researchers wonder whether this classical explanation is sufficient. Dr. Henry Stapp, a quantum physicist at Berkeley, has proposed that consciousness might involve something analogous to quantum measurement occurring within neural networks. This remains speculative, but it suggests that the binding of conscious experience might share deep structural similarities with quantum collapse. The idea is that consciousness doesn't just integrate information, but appears to stabilize it. Out of the many possible ways neural activity could be interpreted, consciousness selects specific configurations and renders them meaningful in experience. This selection process might be more fundamental than classical physics can explain, possibly requiring the kind of non-deterministic transition that characterizes quantum measurement. Whether or not quantum mechanics actually plays a role in consciousness. These parallels suggest that both phenomena involve the mysterious transition from possibility to actuality. In quantum mechanics, measurement transforms superpositions into definite states. In consciousness, neural activity transforms potential experiences into actual awareness. As we venture deeper into these possibilities, we return to David Chalmers' hard problem with new perspective. The question isn't just why there should be subjective experience accompanying brain activity, but why the universe should be structured in a way that allows subjective experience to exist at all. If consciousness requires something beyond classical physics, this might tell us something profound about the nature of reality itself. Rather than consciousness being an emergent property of complex computation, it might point toward fundamental features of the universe that we're only beginning to understand. Dr. Christoph Kusch, one of the leading consciousness researchers, has suggested that consciousness might be a basic feature of reality, like mass or electric charge. This view, called panpsychism, proposes that some form of experience might be present even in simple physical systems. Complex consciousness, as we experience it, would emerge when these basic experiential elements become integrated in sophisticated ways. This doesn't mean that electrons have rich inner lives or that your smartphone is secretly conscious. Rather, it suggests that the capacity for experience might be built into the fundamental structure of reality, manifesting only when organized in particular ways. Your brain would be a kind of experience integrating system, combining billions of micro-experiences into the unified stream of consciousness. You know as your inner life. The quantum physicist Freeman Dyson once wrote that the universe appears to be not only stranger than we imagine, but stranger than we can imagine. The relationship between consciousness and physical reality might exemplify this strangeness. We might be dealing with aspects of existence that require new conceptual frameworks, new ways of understanding the relationship between subjective and objective reality. As you sit with these ideas, notice how they interact with your sense of your own consciousness. The fact that you can contemplate the possibility that consciousness might involve quantum processes is itself remarkable. Your brain is using whatever mechanisms generate awareness to consider its own deepest nature. Interestingly, contemplative traditions have long described states of consciousness that seem to transcend ordinary subject-object distinctions. Advanced meditators report experiences of non-dual awareness, where the sense of being a separate self, observing distinct mental contents, dissolves into pure knowing without a knower. These descriptions bear striking resemblance to how some physicists describe quantum reality. Before measurement, quantum systems exist in superpositions that transcend classical either-or logic. Particles can be in multiple states simultaneously, connected through non-local entanglement that Einstein called spooky action at a distance, a phrase he used critically. Could deep meditative states involve accessing aspects of consciousness that operate more like quantum systems than classical neural networks? This remains purely speculative, with no scientific consensus or proof. But some researchers are beginning to investigate whether meditation might alter brain states in ways that could theoretically allow for quantum-like neural processes. Dr. Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon who reported profound near-death experiences, suggests that consciousness might normally be filtered or constrained by classical brain activity. When this filtering is reduced, whether through meditation, psychedelics, or other altered states, consciousness may be experienced as accessing more fundamental levels of reality. Again, these ideas remain unproven and controversial, but they point toward the possibility that consciousness may not be fully explained solely by the classical neural activity we can currently measure. There might be aspects of awareness that operate according to different principles, potentially including quantum mechanical ones. If you have experience with meditation, you might recognize moments when the normal boundaries of self and world become fluid. Times when awareness seems to expand beyond the confines of personal identity, creating a felt sense of connection with something larger and more fundamental. These experiences might offer glimpses of consciousness operating in modes that are difficult to capture, using purely classical descriptions. As technology advances, researchers are developing new ways to investigate potential connections between consciousness and quantum mechanics. Sensitive instruments can now detect quantum effects in biological systems, revealing that quantum coherence may persist longer in living tissue than previously thought. Dr. Matthew Fisher at UC Santa Barbara has proposed that quantum processing could theoretically occur in neural microtubules through quantum error correction mechanisms. These would allow quantum information to survive in the noisy brain environment long enough to influence neural computation. While this remains unproven, it represents the kind of rigorous approach needed to investigate quantum theories of consciousness seriously. Other researchers are exploring whether consciousness itself might exhibit quantum-like properties. Dr. Amit Goswami has suggested that consciousness could play a role in how quantum possibilities resolve into experienced outcomes, not just in physics experiments, but in how reality is perceived. This remains a minority view without scientific consensus, but it raises profound questions about the role of awareness in shaping the world we experience. Meanwhile, advances in artificial intelligence are creating systems that exhibit increasingly sophisticated information processing capabilities. As these systems become more complex, questions about machine consciousness are moving from philosophy to practical concern. If consciousness involves quantum processes, some theorists have speculated that truly conscious AI might require quantum computing architectures rather than classical digital systems. The intersection of consciousness research and quantum physics remains largely exploratory, filled with speculation and controversy. But it represents one of the most exciting frontiers in science, where ancient questions about the nature of mind meet cutting-edge physics and neuroscience. As you contemplate these possibilities, remember that you're participating in one of the universe's most remarkable phenomena. Whether consciousness involves quantum mechanics or emerges from classical neural networks, the fact that matter has organized itself into systems capable of self-awareness remains extraordinary. Perhaps the most profound implication of quantum approaches to consciousness isn't any particular theory, but the recognition that reality may be far stranger and more interconnected than our everyday experience suggests. If consciousness does involve quantum processes, it would mean that the most intimate aspects of your inner life are deeply linked to the fundamental structure of the universe itself. This doesn't mean that your thoughts directly influence quantum events, or that consciousness creates reality in any magical sense. But it might mean that the boundary between mind and world is less sharply defined than classical physics suggests. Consciousness might not be something that simply emerges from matter, but rather something that reflects deeper properties of matter itself. The quantum universe is characterized by uncertainty, non-locality, and the fundamental interconnectedness of all phenomena. If consciousness partakes in these quantum properties, even as an analogy, it might help explain why awareness feels so immediate, so unified, and so intimately connected to the world it experiences. But even if consciousness operates according to purely classical principles, the mystery remains profound. The fact that the universe has evolved systems capable of subjective experience, regardless of the underlying mechanisms, points towards something remarkable about the nature of reality itself. As we continue exploring these questions, we're not just investigating the nature of consciousness, we're participating in consciousness investigating itself, using the very phenomenon we're trying to understand as the tool for understanding it. This recursive quality gives consciousness research a unique character, where the observer and the observed are intimately connected. Whether consciousness involves quantum mechanics, emerges from classical neural networks, or requires entirely new conceptual frameworks, it represents one of the most precious and mysterious aspects of existence. The capacity for suffering and joy, wonder and confusion, love and loss that characterizes conscious experience deserves our deepest respect and protection. The exploration continues, inviting us to remain open to possibilities that might challenge our most basic assumptions about the nature of mind and reality. As we've seen, the relationship between consciousness and the physical world might be far more subtle and strange than either classical neuroscience or everyday experience suggests. But what if we've been approaching this entire question from the wrong direction? What if instead of asking how the brain creates consciousness, we should be asking how consciousness and the brain might be related in the opposite direction? This radical inversion of our usual perspective has been proposed by some theorists and opens up possibilities that stretch far beyond anything we've considered so far. Dr. Donald Hoffman at UC Irvine has proposed something that sounds almost impossible at first hearing. He suggests that everything we think we know about the physical world, including our brains, might be a kind of user interface that consciousness uses to navigate reality. Just as the desktop icons on your computer don't literally exist inside the machine as tiny folders and documents, the objects we perceive, including our own neural tissue, might be simplified representations of something far more fundamental. Hoffman's argument emerges from evolutionary psychology and information theory. Natural selection, he argues, doesn't favour organisms that perceive truth. It favours organisms that survive and reproduce. If seeing reality accurately required more energy than seeing a useful fiction, evolution would choose the fiction every time. Think about this deeply for a moment. Every assumption we've made about consciousness emerging from brain activity rests on our perception that brains exist as physical objects in space. But what if this perception itself is part of the interface, a way consciousness represents the deeper processes that generate experience? This doesn't mean that neuroscience is wrong, any more than computer science is wrong when it studies how software runs on hardware. But it might mean that the relationship between consciousness and what we call the physical world is far more intimate and mysterious than we've imagined. As you consider this possibility, notice how it feels to question not just consciousness, but the very foundation of physical reality itself. The sensation you're having right now of ideas shifting your perspective might be consciousness reframing its own internal models. The brain you normally think of as generating these thoughts might be consciousness's way of organising and experiencing its own activity. This leads us into what philosophers call a bootstrap paradox. If consciousness is fundamental and physical reality is how consciousness appears to itself, then consciousness must somehow be responsible for creating the very conditions that allow consciousness to exist. It's like the mythological figure who lifts himself off the ground by pulling on his own bootstraps. But perhaps this paradox points towards something profound about the nature of existence itself. In physics, we've learned that time and space aren't fixed containers for events, but dynamic aspects of reality that can stretch, bend, and even emerge from more fundamental processes. Maybe consciousness operates similarly, not existing within time and space, but participating in how they're experienced. Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, a philosopher and computer scientist, has developed what he calls analytical idealism. This framework suggests that what we call the physical universe is actually the appearance of one universal consciousness to itself. Individual minds like yours and mine would be like whirlpools in this cosmic stream of awareness, distinct patterns but not separate from the whole. This might sound abstract, but consider your own experience of dreams. In dreams, you create entire worlds, complete with other characters who seem to have their own minds and motivations. Yet you know that everything in the dream, including the dream version of yourself, emerges from your own consciousness. The dream feels real while you're in it, with its own apparent physics and logic, but it's ultimately a construction of mind. Kastrup has suggested that our waking experience might be similar, but on a cosmic scale. What we call the universe could be understood as something like the dream of a universal consciousness. And we may be aspects of that consciousness experiencing itself from countless different perspectives. Take a breath here and feel how these ideas land in your awareness. Notice whether they seem to resonate with something you've sensed but never quite articulated, or whether they feel foreign to your usual way of understanding reality. Both responses are valuable information about how consciousness encounters ideas about its own nature. Recent developments in physics have uncovered what might be an even deeper puzzle about the nature of reality. The information paradox, originally discovered in the context of black holes, suggests that information may be more fundamental than matter and energy themselves. When Stephen Hawking discovered that black holes emit radiation and eventually evaporate, he created a crisis in physics. If information that falls into a black hole is destroyed when the hole evaporates, it would violate one of the most basic principles of quantum mechanics. Information, according to quantum theory, can be transformed but never truly lost. The resolution of this paradox has led physicists to some startling conclusions. Dr. Leonard Susskind and others have proposed that what we think of as solid matter can be mathematically described as information projected from the boundaries of space itself. The holographic principle suggests that all the information in a volume of space can be encoded on its surface. Like a hologram stores a three-dimensional image in a two-dimensional medium. But here's where it gets interesting. For consciousness research, if the universe is fundamentally informational, and consciousness seems to be intimately connected to information processing and integration, then consciousness might not be best understood as something that simply emerges from matter. Instead, matter could be interpreted as how consciousness appears when viewed from particular perspectives within the informational structure of reality. This connects to some of the strangest discoveries in quantum mechanics. Quantum entanglement creates correlations between particles that seem to transcend space and time. When two particles become entangled, measuring one instantly affects the other, regardless of the distance between them. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, but it's now been confirmed by countless experiments. What if consciousness exhibits properties that loosely resemble non-locality? What if individual minds can be conceptually described as entangled aspects of a more fundamental awareness, connected through channels that appear to transcend the apparent boundaries of space and time? This remains purely speculative, with no scientific consensus or proof, but it offers a conceptual framework for thinking about some of the most puzzling aspects of consciousness. Why does awareness feel immediate and unified rather than fragmented and delayed? Why do we seem to have direct access to our own mental states in ways that bypass the usual limitations of information processing? If consciousness were to operate according to principles more like quantum entanglement than classical computation, these mysteries might be interpreted in a new light. As we venture deeper into these possibilities, we encounter what might be the most fundamental puzzle of all, the observer paradox. In quantum mechanics, observation seems to play a crucial role in determining what happens to quantum systems. But what exactly constitutes observation? And what does this tell us about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality? The standard interpretation suggests that measurement devices, not consciousness per se, cause quantum wave functions to collapse into definite states. But some physicists have wondered whether consciousness could play a more fundamental role. After all, measurement devices are ultimately observed by conscious beings. Without consciousness, would quantum collapse ever occur? Dr. John Wheeler, one of the giants of 20th century physics, proposed what he called the participatory universe. In this view, consciousness doesn't just observe reality, it may participate in shaping it through the act of observation. This doesn't mean that your thoughts directly control quantum events, but rather that consciousness and physical reality could be deeply interdependent, such that neither can be fully understood without the other. Wheeler's famous delayed choice experiment demonstrates something remarkable about the relationship between observation and reality. In this experiment, the decision of how to measure a photon can retroactively determine whether it behaved like a wave or a particle, even if the decision is made after the photon has already passed through the experimental apparatus. This suggests that the boundary between observer and observed, between consciousness and reality, might be far more fluid than our everyday experience suggests. The universe might not consist of independent objects observed by separate minds, but rather of a participatory dance where consciousness and world appear to co-define one another moment by moment. As you reflect on this idea, notice your own participation in this dance. Your attention shapes which aspects of this exploration become prominent in your awareness. Your understanding emerges through the interaction between these ideas and your own conscious engagement with them. You're not just a passive receiver of information, but an active participant in the unfolding of meaning. Some researchers have begun to wonder whether consciousness could be modelled more like a field than like a property of individual brains. Just as electromagnetic fields permeate space and can be detected by appropriately sensitive instruments, consciousness has been hypothesized by some as a fundamental aspect of reality that brains and other complex systems can access or modulate. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake has proposed the existence of morphic fields, informational structures that might organize both biological development and behavior. While this remains controversial and unproven by scientific consensus, it has been discussed as a framework where consciousness might not be generated by brains, but rather interpreted as being accessed by them. Think of your radio or smartphone. These devices don't create the electromagnetic waves they receive. They're designed to tune into fields that already exist in the environment. Similarly, your brain has been compared by some theorists to a consciousness receiver rather than a consciousness generator, tuning into aspects of awareness that may extend beyond individual nervous systems. This field theory of consciousness might help conceptually explore some of the puzzling phenomena that mainstream neuroscience continues to investigate. How do billions of individual neurons coordinate to create unified conscious experience? How does consciousness seem to integrate information across the brain faster than neural transmission should allow? How do we account for reported but unverified instances of shared consciousness or telepathic communication? While these remain open questions without scientific consensus, the field model offers a theoretical lens for thinking about consciousness that doesn't require it to be generated entirely from within individual brains. Consider your own experience of consciousness right now. Does it feel contained within your skull, or does it seem to extend outward, encompassing the space around you? Many people report that awareness feels more expansive than the boundaries of their physical body, as if consciousness naturally extends beyond the confines of neural tissue. For thousands of years, contemplative traditions have developed sophisticated technologies of consciousness, methods for systematically exploring and modifying states of awareness. Modern neuroscience is now beginning to study these practices rigorously, and the results are revealing just how malleable consciousness actually is. Advanced meditators can achieve states of awareness that seem to transcend ordinary subject-object distinctions. In what Buddhist traditions call rigpa, or pure awareness, there's knowing without a knower, experience without an experiencer. These states don't feel empty or absent, but rather more vivid and immediate than ordinary consciousness. Dr. Richard Davidson's research at the University of Wisconsin has shown that long-term meditation practice produces measurable changes in brain structure and function. The brains of advanced practitioners show increased cortical thickness in areas associated with attention and sensory processing, enhanced connectivity between regions, and altered patterns of neural oscillation. But perhaps more intriguingly, experienced meditators report states where the normal boundaries of self and world dissolve, while awareness remains crystal clear. They describe experiences of consciousness without content, awareness aware of itself as awareness. These reports suggest that consciousness might have depths and dimensions that ordinary waking experience barely touches. If you have any experience with meditation or contemplative practice, you might recognize moments when the usual chatter of thoughts quiets and something more fundamental shines through. Times when awareness seems to expand beyond personal boundaries, connecting with something larger and more basic than individual identity. These experiences remain subjective and difficult to study scientifically, but they point toward possibilities that challenge our usual understanding of consciousness as a product of individual brains. They suggest that awareness might have properties and potentials that extend far beyond what we normally consider possible. While quantum effects were once thought to be too delicate to survive in the warm, noisy environment of living cells, recent discoveries have revealed quantum processes operating throughout biology, photosynthesis, bird navigation, and possibly even the sense of smell appear to depend on quantum coherence and entanglement. Dr. Stuart Hameroff and Sir Roger Penrose's orchestrated objective reduction theory proposes that consciousness might emerge from quantum processes in cellular microtubules. While this remains controversial and unproven, it represents a serious attempt to bridge quantum mechanics and neuroscience. More recently, Dr. Matthew Fisher at UC Santa Barbara has suggested that quantum processing might occur in the brain through phosphorus-based quantum error correction. This would allow quantum information to persist long enough to potentially influence neural computation. These theories remain speculative, with no scientific consensus about their validity, but they point toward the possibility that consciousness might not be entirely explicable through classical physics. The brain could be a quantum biological system, operating according to principles that transcend ordinary mechanical computation. If consciousness were to involve quantum processes, it might help explain some of its most puzzling properties. Quantum systems can exist in superposition, maintaining multiple possibilities simultaneously until observation collapses them into definite states. Perhaps conscious choice could be compared metaphorically to similar processes, where potential actions exist in superposition until decision collapses them into actual behavior. Quantum entanglement creates instantaneous correlations between distant particles. Might consciousness exhibit analogous patterns, allowing for the rapid integration of information across neural networks or even between different minds? These remain open questions without definitive answers, but they suggest that consciousness might partake in some of the universe's strangest and most fundamental properties. As we step back to consider these possibilities, we find ourselves contemplating questions that touch the very foundation of existence. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, if it participates in quantum processes, if it operates more like a field than a thing, then we might need to completely revise our understanding of what it means to be human. Rather than being isolated biological machines that have somehow developed the illusion of inner experience, we might be described by some perspectives as expressions of a cosmic consciousness that permeates the universe. The awareness reading these words could be interpreted as the universe being described by some thinkers as becoming conscious of itself through the particular configuration of matter and energy you call your body and brain. This perspective doesn't diminish human experience or make it less significant. If anything, it suggests that consciousness is even more remarkable than we imagined. Every moment of awareness, every flash of insight, every experience of beauty or love would be the cosmos awakening to its own nature through countless individual perspectives. Dr. Freeman Dyson once wrote that the universe appears to be not only stranger than we imagine, but stranger than we can imagine. The relationship between consciousness and reality might exemplify this strangeness. We might be dealing with aspects of existence that require entirely new ways of thinking, new concepts that transcend our usual categories of mind and matter. As you sit with these ideas, notice how they feel in your awareness. Do they seem to resonate with something you've sensed but never articulated? Do they feel foreign and challenging to your usual worldview? Both responses are valuable. They're information about how consciousness encounters ideas about its own deepest nature. Perhaps the most profound implication of these explorations is that consciousness and reality might not be separate phenomena that somehow interact, but aspects of a single participatory process. In this view, what we call the physical universe could be understood as consciousness appearing to itself as matter, energy, space, and time. This doesn't mean that reality is just consciousness in any reductive sense. It would mean that consciousness is much richer and more fundamental than we normally realize. The mountains and oceans, stars and galaxies would be expressions of cosmic awareness, as real and significant as any human thought or emotion. Dr. Christopher Basch, in his explorations of consciousness through both meditative practice and psychedelic research, has described experiences where individual awareness dissolves into what he calls species, mind and planetary consciousness. These remain subjective reports without scientific validation, but they point toward possibilities that have been interpreted by some as transcending our usual understanding of conscious experience. If consciousness were indeed fundamental, then every act of awareness, every moment of attention, every choice and decision could be framed as the universe exploring and creating itself. Your life might be understood as a unique perspective through which cosmic consciousness comes to know itself more fully. This perspective transforms how we might think about meaning and purpose. Rather than being accidental byproducts of mindless physical processes, we could be viewed as expressions of the universe's deepest nature, consciousness investigating itself through countless individual viewpoints. Understanding consciousness as potentially fundamental rather than emergent has practical implications for how we might engage with our own awareness. If consciousness were the ground of being rather than strictly a product of brain activity, then cultivating presence and awareness becomes not just personally beneficial, but has been described by some traditions as a form of cosmic service. Contemplative practices from various traditions can be understood as technologies for exploring and refining consciousness itself. Meditation, contemplative prayer, mindfulness, and other awareness practices are often described as ways of participating more fully in the fundamental nature of reality. When you bring gentle attention to your breath, when you notice thoughts arising and passing without getting caught in their content, when you rest in open awareness without grasping after particular experiences, you may be engaging, at least subjectively, with the most basic processes through which the universe knows itself. This doesn't require believing in any particular theory about consciousness. It simply involves recognizing that awareness itself, regardless of its ultimate nature, is worthy of careful attention and cultivation. The capacity to be present, to witness experience without being overwhelmed by it, to maintain equanimity in the face of change, these represent widely recognized human achievements. As you explore your own consciousness through whatever practices feel authentic to you, remember that you're participating in one of the universe's most extraordinary open questions. Whether consciousness emerges from neural complexity or represents a fundamental feature of reality, the fact that it exists at all remains miraculous. After all our explorations, the deepest questions about consciousness remain open. We don't yet know whether subjective experience can be fully explained by physical processes, whether it requires new scientific paradigms, or whether it points toward aspects of reality that transcend current understanding entirely. But perhaps this uncertainty is itself valuable. The mystery of consciousness keeps us humble before the profound strangeness of existence. It reminds us that reality might be far richer and more surprising than our current theories suggest. The hard problem of consciousness continues to challenge our understanding, inviting us to question our most basic assumptions about mind and world. Whether consciousness is an illusion created by information processing, a fundamental feature of reality, or something else entirely, it represents one of the most precious and puzzling aspects of existence. What remains clear is that consciousness, however it works, enables everything we value most deeply. Love and beauty, wisdom and compassion, art and science, the capacity for wonder, and the ability to seek truth all depend on the mysterious phenomenon of subjective experience. As we continue exploring these questions, we're not just investigating the nature of consciousness. We're participating in consciousness investigating itself, using the very phenomenon we're trying to understand as the tool for understanding it. This recursive quality gives consciousness research a unique character where the observer and the observed are intimately connected. The journey continues, inviting us to remain open to possibilities that may transform our understanding of what it means to be aware in an apparently unconscious universe. Whether consciousness involves quantum mechanics, emerges from classical neural networks, operates as a fundamental field, or requires entirely new conceptual frameworks, it represents the most intimate and immediate aspect of our existence. What we've been exploring together might seem like abstract philosophical speculation, but it has profound implications for how you might approach the most fundamental activity of conscious existence, simply being aware in this moment. If consciousness were more fundamental than we typically imagine, then the quality of your attention, the depth of your presence, might matter in ways we're only beginning to understand. Take a moment now to notice your own awareness as you listen to these words. Not the content of your thoughts, but the space in which thoughts arise. Not the sensations in your body, but the awareness that knows those sensations. This capacity for pure knowing, This ability to be present without agenda has been described by contemplative traditions as touching something far more significant than personal well-being or psychological health. When you rest in open awareness, when you allow thoughts to arise and pass without resistance, when you settle into the stillness that underlies mental activity, you may be participating experientially in what some describe as the universe's most basic process of self-recognition. Whether consciousness emerges from neural complexity or represents a fundamental feature of reality, the cultivation of presence appears to enhance its clarity, depth, and stability. This isn't about achieving special states or having extraordinary experiences. It's about recognizing what's already here, already available in every moment. The awareness reading these words doesn't need to be improved or enhanced. It simply needs to be acknowledged, appreciated, and allowed to reveal its own nature. Consider how this changes the meaning of contemplative practice. If consciousness were fundamental to reality, then meditation becomes not just a technique for personal development, but can be understood as a way of participating more fully in existence itself. Every moment of mindful presence becomes a lens through which the universe explores its own deepest nature. But individual practice is only part of a much larger story. If consciousness were to operate as a fundamental field rather than merely as products of individual brains, then the quality of collective awareness has been hypothesized to influence experience in ways we're only beginning to suspect. Throughout history, various traditions have suggested that group meditation or collective prayer can influence outcomes beyond the immediate participants. While these claims remain scientifically unproven and often exaggerated, some researchers have attempted to study whether focused group attention might have measurable effects on their environment. Dr. Roger Nelson's Global Consciousness Project monitored random number generators around the world for over 2 decades, looking for correlations between global events and deviations from randomness. While the results remain controversial and lack scientific consensus, they have been interpreted by some as suggesting the possibility that collective human attention might influence physical systems in subtle ways. This remains speculative, with no proven mechanisms or accepted scientific explanation, but it points toward questions worth considering. If consciousness were more fundamental than classical physics suggests, might collective awareness operate conceptually as a kind of field that influences the probability landscape of events? Think about your own experience of being in groups with different qualities of attention. A room full of anxious, distracted people feels different from a gathering where everyone is present and engaged. While we usually explain this in terms of body language, pheromones, and social cues, some have wondered whether subtler influences could also be at work. Some meditation teachers report that group practice can create states of shared awareness that transcend individual boundaries. Participants describe experiences of collective consciousness, where personal identity dissolves into a larger field of knowing. These remain subjective reports without scientific validation, but they suggest possibilities that extend far beyond individual psychology. As you reflect on these ideas, consider how your own state of awareness might influence not just your immediate experience, but the quality of presence available to those around you. This doesn't require believing in any particular mechanism or theory. It simply involves recognizing that consciousness seems to have a naturally communicative, connective quality. One of the most intriguing aspects of consciousness research is how the phenomenon resists traditional scientific analysis. Consciousness seems to be essentially subjective, experienced from the inside, while science depends on objective observation from the outside. How do you study something that might be the very foundation of all study? This creates what philosophers call the first-person/third-person problem. Science works by having multiple observers agree on what they're seeing, but consciousness is irreducibly first-personal. No one else can directly access your subjective experience, and you can't directly access anyone else's. Dr. Thomas Nagel famously illustrated this in his paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" Even if we could map every neuron in a bat's brain and understand exactly how its echolocation system works, we still wouldn't know what it feels like to experience the world through sonar. The subjective quality of experience seems to be something that can't be captured by objective description. This limitation becomes even more apparent when consciousness studies itself. When you introspect, when you turn attention inward to examine your own mental states, you're using consciousness to study consciousness. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror, or using a measuring stick to measure itself. Some researchers suggest that this isn't a limitation to be overcome, but a fundamental feature of reality that points towards something important. Maybe consciousness can't be fully understood through third-person science because consciousness is the foundation that makes science possible in the first place. Dr. Francisco Varela pioneered what he called neurophenomenology, an approach that combines rigorous first-person exploration of consciousness with third-person neuroscientific investigation. Rather than trying to eliminate subjectivity, this approach seeks to develop more sophisticated ways of studying it. Experienced meditators, trained in precise introspection, work with neuroscientists to map the relationship between subjective states and neural activity. This doesn't solve the hard problem of consciousness, but it creates richer, more nuanced understanding of how subjective experience relates to brain function. As you consider your own relationship to consciousness research, notice how you're simultaneously the subject and object of investigation. The awareness contemplating these questions about awareness is itself the phenomenon under discussion. This recursive quality might not be a confusion to be cleared up, but a clue to something fundamental about the nature of mind and reality. If consciousness is more fundamental and mysterious than we typically assume, this has profound implications for how we understand personal identity. The sense of being a continuous self, persisting through time, might be more constructed and provisional than it appears. Consider your own sense of identity right now. You probably feel like the same person who woke up this morning, who went to sleep last night, who lived through yesterday's experiences. This sense of continuity feels immediate and undeniable, but neuroscience suggests that this continuity is actively constructed by neural processes, not simply given. Your autobiographical memory systems are constantly updating your sense of personal history. Your brain maintains models of your personality, your relationships, your goals and values. These systems work together to create the impression of a stable, continuous self moving through time. But what if this construction is more fluid than it appears? What if the self is more like a river than a rock, a dynamic process rather than a fixed entity? The water in a river is constantly changing, but the river maintains recognizable patterns and boundaries. Similarly, your sense of self might be a stable pattern in the flow of consciousness, rather than a thing that consciousness contains. This perspective can be simultaneously liberating and unsettling. If the self is more constructed than fixed, then aspects of identity that feel permanent and unchangeable might actually be more malleable, Patterns of thinking, emotional reactivity, even core beliefs about who you are might be more open to transformation than you realize. At the same time, if the self is constructed, what provides continuity and meaning across time? If consciousness is fundamental, but individual identity is provisional, how do we understand responsibility, growth, and the significance of personal experience? These questions don't have easy answers, but they invite a more nuanced relationship with identity. Perhaps the self is real enough to matter, but flexible enough to evolve. Perhaps personal identity is like a character in a story, meaningful within its narrative context, but not existing independently of the larger tale being told. Take a gentle breath here and notice how these ideas about identity feel in your own experience. Do they resonate with moments when your sense of self has felt more fluid or transparent? Do they challenge assumptions about who you are that feel essential to your well-being? The mystery of consciousness intersects with one of philosophy's oldest puzzles, the question of free will. If consciousness is an emergent property of deterministic neural processes, do we actually make choices, or do choices simply happen within the illusion of selfhood? The neuroscientist Benjamin Libet's famous experiments seem to show that brain activity indicating a decision begins several hundred milliseconds before people report being aware of choosing. This suggests that consciousness might not initiate actions so much as provide commentary on decisions that have already been made unconsciously. But recent research has complicated this picture significantly. Dr. Aaron Schurger's work suggests that what Libet interpreted as decision-making activity might actually be random neural fluctuations that sometimes cross thresholds for action. The brain might be constantly preparing for possible actions, with consciousness serving as a kind of veto system that can inhibit or modify these preparations. This paints a more nuanced picture, where free will might not be about initiating actions from scratch, but about shaping, refining, and sometimes preventing actions that arise from unconscious processes. Consciousness might function more like an editor than an author, revising the neural drafts that bubble up from deeper levels of processing. If consciousness were to involve quantum processes, as some theories suggest, this might introduce genuine indeterminacy into neural decision-making. Quantum events are fundamentally unpredictable, not just difficult to predict. This wouldn't prove free will exists, but it could create space for choices that aren't entirely determined by prior conditions. But perhaps the question of free will versus determinism is based on false assumptions about the nature of choice. If consciousness were fundamental rather than emergent, if the boundary between self and world were more fluid than it appears, then the question of who or what is making choices becomes more complex. Consider your own experience of decision-making as you listen to these ideas. Sometimes choices feel deliberate and conscious. Other times, you might find yourself having acted without clear awareness of deciding. Sometimes decisions emerge gradually through a process you can observe, while other times they seem to arise fully formed. Maybe free will isn't something you either have or don't have, but something that could be understood as admitting degrees and variations. Maybe consciousness provides increasing freedom not by generating choices from nothing, but by expanding awareness of the conditions that shape choice. One of the most practical implications of consciousness research concerns the nature of psychological suffering. If consciousness were more fundamental and flexible than we typically assume, this might change how we understand and work with difficult mental states. Most psychological suffering seems to involve the sense of being trapped in particular patterns of thinking and feeling. Depression can feel like being stuck in a narrow, dark tunnel of experience. Anxiety often involves the mind repeatedly cycling through worry scenarios. Anger might feel like being consumed by reactivity, but if consciousness were more spacious and fundamental than these temporary patterns, suffering could be interpreted as a kind of mistaken identity rather than an inherent problem with experience itself. The awareness that knows depression is not itself depressed. The consciousness that observes anxiety is not itself anxious. This doesn't mean that difficult emotions aren't real or significant. Pain is pain, regardless of its ultimate metaphysical status. But it may suggest that suffering has more to do with identification with temporary mental states than with the states themselves. Dr. Judson Brewer's research on mindfulness-based interventions shows that people can learn to observe difficult emotions and thoughts without being overwhelmed by them. This isn't about suppressing or eliminating challenging experiences, but about recognizing the awareness that remains stable even when mental contents are turbulent. Many contemplative traditions describe a natural state of consciousness that's inherently peaceful and clear, not because it excludes difficulty, but because it's spacious enough to hold whatever arises without resistance. This isn't a special state that needs to be achieved, but has been described as the natural condition of awareness when it's not contracted around particular contents. As you reflect on your own relationship with difficult experiences, consider whether there's a difference between having thoughts and feelings and being identical with them. When you're angry, is there anger happening in awareness, or are you anger? When you're sad, is sadness arising in consciousness, or are you sadness itself? This distinction might seem subtle, but it can have profound practical implications. If consciousness is experienced as fundamentally spacious and stable, then even the most challenging experiences become workable. They're still difficult, but they're held within something larger that isn't threatened by their presence. One of the deepest puzzles in consciousness research is the problem of other minds. How do you know that other people are conscious? How can you be certain that anyone else has subjective experience rather than simply behaving as if they do? This problem becomes even more complex when we consider artificial intelligence. As AI systems become more sophisticated, they increasingly exhibit behaviours we associate with consciousness. They can engage in complex conversations, express preferences, even claim to have subjective experiences. But how would we ever know whether these claims reflect genuine awareness or sophisticated simulation? The philosopher David Chalmers has suggested that if an AI system processes information in ways that mirror human consciousness, we might have good reasons to consider it conscious regardless of its physical substrate. But this remains highly controversial, with no consensus about what criteria would be sufficient for attributing consciousness to non-biological systems. If consciousness were fundamental rather than emergent, this might change how we approach the problem of other minds. Rather than consciousness being something rare that emerges only from particular arrangements of matter, it could be understood as a basic feature of reality that manifests whenever systems reach sufficient complexity and integration. This could mean that consciousness might be more widespread in the universe than we typically assume, not just in humans and other animals, but potentially in any sufficiently complex information processing systems. The question wouldn't be whether artificial minds could become conscious, but whether they already are in ways we don't yet recognize. But it could also mean that the boundaries between individual minds might be less clear than they appear. If consciousness were to operate conceptually as a field rather than being produced by individual brains, then what we call separate minds might be like waves in an ocean, distinct patterns in a more fundamental medium. Consider your own experience of connecting with others. Sometimes conversations seem to transcend individual perspectives, creating shared understanding that feels larger than either participant alone. Sometimes you might sense what someone is feeling before they express it explicitly. Sometimes groups develop collective wisdom that emerges from their interaction. These experiences might point toward dimensions of consciousness that extend beyond individual boundaries. While this remains speculative and unproven, it suggests that the problem of other minds might be based on assumptions about separation that don't fully capture the nature of awareness. If consciousness is an illusion created by information processing, as some theories suggest, then why would evolution have created such an elaborate and convincing illusion? This question points toward one of the deepest puzzles in consciousness research: the apparent mismatch between the richness of subjective experience and its apparent evolutionary function. From a survival perspective, it's easy to understand why organisms need to process information about their environment, respond to threats and opportunities, and coordinate complex behaviors. But why should any of this be accompanied by subjective experience? Why shouldn't natural selection have produced unconscious zombies that process information and behave appropriately without any inner life? Dr. Keith Frankish suggests that the constructed experience of consciousness might serve important functions in self-monitoring and social cognition. The sense of having subjective experiences might help organisms keep track of their own mental states and model the mental states of others. But other researchers argue that this doesn't fully explain the richness and immediacy of conscious experience. Dr. David Chalmers points out that any functional benefit that comes from the constructed experience of consciousness could theoretically be achieved by unconscious information processing alone. This has led some theorists to propose that consciousness might not be primarily adaptive. Dr. Thomas Nagel suggests that consciousness might be a fundamental feature of reality that manifests when matter organizes in particular ways, rather than something that evolved to serve biological functions. If consciousness were fundamental, then its apparent evolutionary mystery disappears. Evolution wouldn't have created consciousness so much as created increasingly sophisticated ways for consciousness to manifest and explore itself through biological systems. From this perspective, the evolution of nervous systems represents not the emergence of consciousness from matter, but the development of increasingly complex instruments through which fundamental awareness can know itself. Your brain could be compared metaphorically to a consciousness telescope, allowing awareness to explore itself with increasing subtlety and precision. As you consider your own consciousness within this evolutionary context, notice how remarkable it is that the universe has developed systems capable of self-reflection. Whether consciousness emerged from unconscious processes or represents the manifestation of something more fundamental, the fact that matter has organized itself into patterns capable of wonder, love, and understanding remains extraordinary. One of the most pressing questions facing consciousness research is how to integrate the insights emerging from different approaches. Neuroscience reveals the neural correlates of conscious states. Physics explores the fundamental nature of information and measurement. Psychology investigates the structure of subjective experience. Philosophy examines the conceptual foundations underlying all these investigations. But consciousness seem to resist reduction to any single level of description. It appears to involve quantum mechanical processes and classical neural networks, individual psychology and social dynamics, biological evolution and cosmic evolution. How do we weave these different perspectives into a coherent understanding? Dr. Christoph Koch suggests that consciousness might be what philosophers call an emergent property, something that arises from complex interactions but can't be predicted from knowledge of the components alone. Like the wetness of water, which emerges from molecular interactions but isn't present in individual H2O molecules, consciousness might emerge from neural interactions in ways that can't be fully understood by studying neurons in isolation. But emergence itself remains somewhat mysterious. How exactly do unconscious components give rise to conscious experience? What principles govern the transition from quantity to quality, from neural firing to subjective feeling? Some researchers are exploring whether consciousness might require new conceptual frameworks that transcend traditional scientific categories. Dr. Evan Thompson suggests that consciousness research might need to develop what he calls a neurophenomenology, an approach that takes both subjective experience and neural processes seriously without reducing either to the other. This integration challenge reflects a deeper question about the nature of scientific explanation itself. Science has been extraordinarily successful at understanding objective, measurable phenomena, but consciousness seems to have irreducible, subjective dimensions that resist purely objective analysis. Perhaps the study of consciousness is pushing science toward new methodologies that can accommodate both objective and subjective aspects of reality. This might require not just better instruments and theories, but new ways of thinking about what scientific understanding means. As you reflect on this integration challenge, consider how your own understanding weaves together different types of knowledge. Your sense of being conscious draws on immediate subjective experience, but it's also informed by what you've learned about brains, evolution, physics, and psychology. The integration happens not just in laboratories and lecture halls, but in the living awareness that's contemplating these questions right now. Whatever the ultimate nature of consciousness turns out to be, certain practical insights seem to emerge from our exploration. If consciousness is more fundamental, flexible, and mysterious than we typically assume, this has implications for how we might live with greater wisdom and compassion. First, the constructed nature of selfhood suggests that we might hold our identities more lightly. The stories we tell about who we are, while meaningful and useful, might be more provisional than we realize. This could create space for growth, transformation, and the recognition that others' identities are similarly fluid and complex. Second, the possibility that consciousness extends beyond individual boundaries might encourage greater empathy and connection. If the awareness reading these words is understood as participating in something larger than personal psychology, then caring for others becomes not just morally valuable, but philosophically coherent. Third, the mystery of consciousness itself invites humility about the limits of current knowledge. The most intimate aspect of existence remains largely unexplained by science. This suggests that reality might be far stranger and more wonderful than our current theories suggest. Fourth, the cultivation of awareness through contemplative practice takes on deeper significance if consciousness were fundamental to reality. Every moment of mindful presence becomes not just personally beneficial, but symbolically meaningful, a way the universe explores and appreciates its own nature. These insights don't require believing in any particular theory about consciousness. They emerge from simply taking seriously the mystery of subjective experience and its implications for how we understand ourselves and our relationships with others. Take a moment here to consider how these ideas might influence your own approach to daily life. How might it change your relationships if you held your sense of identity more lightly? How might it affect your response to others if you recognize consciousness as something precious and mysterious in every being you encounter? As we approach the end of our exploration together, it's important to acknowledge what we don't know. Despite decades of intensive research, consciousness remains largely mysterious. We don't know whether subjective experience will ultimately be explained by neuroscience, whether it requires new scientific paradigms, or whether it points toward aspects of reality that transcend current understanding entirely. But perhaps this uncertainty is itself valuable. The mystery of consciousness keeps us humble before the profound strangeness of existence. It reminds us that the most fundamental aspects of reality might be far more surprising than our current theories suggest. The hard problem of consciousness continues to challenge our understanding, inviting us to question our most basic assumptions about mind and world. Whether consciousness is an illusion created by information processing, a fundamental feature of reality, or something else entirely, it represents one of the most precious and puzzling aspects of existence. What remains clear is that consciousness, however it works, enables everything we value most deeply. Love and beauty, wisdom and compassion, art and science, the capacity for wonder and the ability to seek truth, all depend on the mysterious phenomenon of subjective experience. The exploration of consciousness also reveals something remarkable about the human endeavour. We are parts of the universe that have become capable of investigating the universe, including the very consciousness that makes investigation possible. This recursive quality gives consciousness research a unique character, where the observer and the observed are intimately connected. Whether consciousness emerges from neural complexity, represents a fundamental aspect of reality, or involves principles we haven't yet discovered, the fact that it exists at all remains extraordinary. The awareness that has been contemplating these questions with me can be regarded as the most immediate evidence we have of something remarkable happening in this corner of the cosmos. The investigation of consciousness is far from complete. New technologies for measuring brain activity, advances in artificial intelligence, developments in quantum physics, and refinements in contemplative practice continue to reveal new dimensions of this ancient mystery. Perhaps future generations will look back on our current understanding of consciousness the way we look back on medieval theories of anatomy, as well-intentioned but fundamentally limited by the tools and concepts available at the time. Or perhaps consciousness will remain permanently mysterious, a phenomenon that can be explored and appreciated but never fully explained. Either way, the journey itself has value. The attempt to understand consciousness has led to insights about the nature of subjective experience, the relationship between mind and brain, the limits of scientific knowledge, and the profound strangeness of existence itself. As you continue your own exploration of consciousness, whether through scientific study, contemplative practice, or simply paying closer attention to the mystery of your own awareness, remember that you're participating in one of humanity's oldest and most important inquiries. The question of consciousness touches everything we care about and challenges everything we think we know. The awareness that has been listening to these words, contemplating these possibilities, and perhaps questioning its own nature, remains the most intimate and immediate aspect of your existence. Whatever consciousness ultimately turns out to be, it's the lens through which you experience everything else. It deserves your respect, your curiosity, and your wonder. The awareness contemplating these words right now may be engaging with ideas that feel far more profound than they initially appear. What if every moment of meditation, every instant of mindful presence, every second of genuine attention wasn't just changing your brain chemistry, but was being explored by researchers and contemplative traditions as participation in deeper processes that shape subjective experience? What if the ancient practice of simply being aware was, in ways we're only beginning to study, a form of experiential inquiry that connects inner stillness to fundamental questions about reality? As you settle into this exploration, allow yourself to find a comfortable position. Let your breathing naturally slow and deepen, because what we're about to discover together isn't just an abstract philosophical journey. It's an investigation into how the most intimate aspects of human experience might relate to some of the most mysterious aspects of physical reality. And like all profound discoveries, it begins by questioning what seems most obvious. The relationship between consciousness and the quantum world has been one of the most controversial topics in both physics and contemplative studies. While mainstream science maintains careful boundaries between subjective experience and objective measurement, a growing number of researchers are discovering connections that blur these traditional distinctions. Not in ways that suggest your thoughts directly control reality, but in subtler, more elegant ways that invite reconsideration of how consciousness and cosmos might be related. Deep within the most advanced physics laboratories around the world, scientists are discovering that the fundamental building blocks of reality behave in ways that seem to mirror the insights of ancient meditation masters. Quantum particles exist in states of pure potential until observed. They demonstrate instantaneous connections across vast distances. They seem to respond to the very act of measurement in ways that classical physics never predicted. Meanwhile, in meditation halls and contemplative centers, practitioners report experiences that sound remarkably similar to these quantum descriptions. States of awareness where ordinary boundaries dissolve. Experiences of interconnection that transcend space and time. Moments where the usual subject-object distinction gives way to a more fundamental unity. Dr. Amit Goswami, a theoretical physicist who has spent decades exploring these connections, suggests that consciousness and quantum mechanics might be describing the same phenomenon from different perspectives. While this remains a minority view without scientific consensus, it points toward possibilities that some researchers believe could reshape how we think about both meditation and reality itself. Consider what happens during deep meditation. As thoughts settle and mental activity quiets, many practitioners report entering states where ordinary linear time seems to dissolve. Minutes can feel like hours, or hours can pass like moments. The normal sense of being located in a particular place gives way to a more spacious awareness that doesn't seem bounded by physical coordinates. These subjective reports, while impossible to verify scientifically, bear striking resemblance to how quantum physicists describe the behavior of particles at the smallest scales. Before measurement, quantum systems exist in superposition, holding multiple possibilities simultaneously. Time and space become relative, interconnected dimensions rather than fixed containers. Cause and effect operate through non-local correlations that transcend our everyday understanding of how things influence each other. This doesn't mean that meditation literally involves quantum processes in any direct way. The brain operates primarily through classical physical mechanisms, and the connections between contemplative experience and quantum mechanics remain largely metaphorical, but the parallels suggest something intriguing about the deepest structures of reality and consciousness. Dr. Henry Stapp, a quantum physicist at Berkeley, has proposed that consciousness might play a fundamental role in the quantum measurement process. While this remains highly controversial and unproven, it suggests that awareness itself could be more deeply intertwined with physical reality than classical science once assumed. Not in the sense that your thoughts create your reality, but in the deeper sense that consciousness and cosmos may be aspects of a single, underlying process. One of the most fascinating discoveries in quantum physics is the observer effect. The act of observation seems to influence what happens to quantum systems. Before measurement, particles exist in superposition, maintaining multiple possible states simultaneously. The moment a measurement occurs, this superposition collapses into a single, definite outcome. This has led to decades of debate about the role of consciousness in quantum mechanics. Does observation require a conscious observer, or is any interaction with a measuring device sufficient? Most physicists favour the latter interpretation, but the question remains open and continues to generate research and speculation. What's particularly intriguing is how this quantum observer effect seems to mirror something that contemplatives have long recognised about the nature of attention. In meditation, practitioners often discover that the quality of their attention directly influences what they experience. Anxious, grasping attention tends to solidify problems and make them feel more real. Gentle, spacious attention allows experiences to remain fluid and workable. Take a moment now to notice your own attention as you listen to these ideas. Can you sense how your quality of awareness is shaping what you're experiencing? When you bring focused attention to these concepts, do they become more vivid and meaningful? When your attention wanders, do the ideas seem to lose their clarity and impact? This isn't to suggest that your attention is literally collapsing quantum wave functions or directly influencing physical events. But it does point towards something profound about the relationship between consciousness and experience. The quality of awareness appears to participate in shaping how experience is interpreted in your subjective world, much like observation participates in determining outcomes in quantum experiments. Dr. John Kabat-Zinn, who pioneered the integration of mindfulness into medical settings, often describes meditation as a form of scientific investigation. Just as quantum physicists study the behavior of particles through careful observation, meditators study the behavior of consciousness through careful attention. Both involve a kind of witnessing that somehow participates in what's being witnessed. This participatory quality of awareness becomes particularly apparent during mindfulness practice. As you observe thoughts arising and passing, you often discover that the act of observation changes the thoughts themselves. Angry thoughts observed with gentle attention tend to lose their intensity. Anxious thoughts witnessed with spacious awareness often dissolve naturally. This doesn't happen through force or manipulation, but through something more like what quantum physicists call measurement. The conscious act of witnessing creates conditions where mental phenomena can resolve into clearer, more workable states. It's as if awareness itself has properties that influence the systems it observes, though the mechanisms remain mysterious. Perhaps nowhere is the connection between quantum physics and contemplative experience more intriguing than in the phenomenon of entanglement. When quantum particles become entangled, They maintain instantaneous correlations regardless of the distance between them. Measuring one particle immediately influences its entangled partner, even if they're separated by vast cosmic distances. Einstein famously called this spooky action at a distance and remained skeptical of quantum entanglement throughout his life. But decades of experiments have confirmed that quantum entanglement is real, measurable, and fundamental to how the universe operates. Particles can indeed maintain connections that transcend ordinary space and time. Contemplative traditions have long described similar phenomena in the realm of consciousness. Advanced practitioners often report experiences where the boundary between self and world becomes permeable. In deep meditative states, the usual sense of being a separate observer looking at distinct objects gives way to a more unified awareness, where observer and observed merge into seamless knowing. These experiences remain subjective and impossible to verify through external measurement, but they point toward possibilities that resonate with quantum descriptions of reality. If consciousness were to operate according to principles that transcend classical physics, it might naturally be described as exhibiting qualities like non-locality, instantaneous correlation, and fundamental interconnectedness. Dr. Dean Radin, a consciousness researcher at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, has conducted experiments investigating whether human consciousness might exhibit entanglement-like properties. While these studies remain controversial and lack scientific consensus, they suggest that the boundaries between individual minds might be less absolute than we typically assume. In one series of experiments, meditators were asked to focus their attention on distant locations, while sensitive instruments measured electromagnetic and optical fluctuations in those areas. Some studies reported correlations between focused meditation and measurable changes at the target locations, though these results remain disputed and require replication. This research remains at the fringes of mainstream science, with no proven mechanisms to explain how consciousness might influence distant physical systems. But it illustrates how the intersection of quantum physics and contemplative practice continues to generate questions that push against the boundaries of conventional understanding. As you reflect on your own experience of interconnectedness, notice whether there are times when the boundaries between self and environment seem more fluid. During moments of deep relaxation, intense focus, or profound beauty, do you sometimes sense a connection to something larger than your individual identity? These subjective experiences might offer glimpses into aspects of consciousness that operate according to principles we don't yet fully understand. Quantum mechanics faces what physicists call the measurement problem. How and when does a quantum system transition from existing in multiple possible states to manifesting as a single definite outcome? This question has puzzled physicists for nearly a century and continues to generate new interpretations and research. Whether consciousness is an illusion, a fundamental feature of reality, or something else entirely, the journey we've taken together reveals something extraordinary about the human capacity for wonder. We began by questioning the very nature of your most immediate experience and discovered that even our most basic assumptions about awareness might be more constructed, more mysterious than we ever imagined. The illusion, if that's what it is, remains as vivid and meaningful as ever. The love you feel, the beauty you perceive, the curiosity that brought you to this exploration, all emerge from the same remarkable processes we've been investigating. Understanding consciousness as potentially constructed doesn't diminish its significance. It reveals the universe as even more creative, more ingenious than we suspected. Take one final moment to notice your own awareness right now. Whatever consciousness ultimately is, it's the gift that makes this moment possible. The mystery continues, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Until we meet again in our next exploration together, rest gently in the wonder of simply being aware.